Welcome, everyone. This election season, the North Pacific's Ministry of Radio is sponsoring a series of voice chat and text based town halls for each candidate. We hope this event is informative, and we encourage you to participate by posing questions in the chat. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the show, Madjack.
Thank you for having me on.
I'd like to dive straight into things as I have with each of the other candidates for each of the other elections in this show. First and foremost, can you give us a brief history of your time in the North Pacific, including each of the positions that you've formerly held within our regional government?
I was initially dragged in because Unibot wanted to defend us in TMP. That was how I ended up here in like 2010, 2011. But I didn't stay for long, and I ended up mainly in Osiris, where I served as delegate, and Bowder, where I was their version of a culture minister. I think they called it Home Affairs at the time. And just stuck around places like the UDL and stuff, where I was a lieutenant there before leaving. And eventually I got myself declared delete on site on NS in 2014, and wasn't around on NS until the end of 2018. But I stayed in TMP because Raven and MCM were here, and they happily gave me sort of like a second chance to run TMP's roleplay, where up until the end of 2019, I was the lead roleplay moderator.
Well, I'm glad you stuck around because you've been a monumental influence on the region, and your legacy as roleplay moderator continues to this day. So, with that aside, I guess we'll continue on to your role as or candidate as speaker. So, why did you decide to run for speaker instead of delegate, as so many had initially suspected?
I think the two times that I ran for delegate showed that either I wasn't ready or the universe didn't want me to be delegate, because both times either I did something or someone else did something that made it that I wasn't able to win. The first time I was pulled up over some comments I made about TSP and the coup Mal pulled off there that he mentioned. Just as a point of history, I didn't support that coup. I was in charge of Osiris at the time and was one of the leading voices against the coup. The second time I broke laws and did some really stupid stuff whilst I was very, very drunk on rum. That's why rum's not great, kids. Don't drink rum. Drink other things, but don't drink rum. I ran for speaker because I joined the office because I saw it was kind of in chaos and had been since it'd not been great for a while, had it? Like, to be honest, like the sheets weren't getting fully updated, and there were citizens who weren't citizens and residents who didn't have nations, and so I volunteered to help out Doropia, and I found myself really enjoying it. Like, the work isn't entirely interesting, but it's one of the only roles where you get an instant sense of achievement. Like it's a small sense of achievement because ultimately what you're doing is basically paperwork. But at the same time, because of the work you do, people in TMP have citizenship, and if you're not there to do the work, the flow of citizens into the region stops. And I found myself enjoying that element of it and other things, and figured, why not run? I've basically run the office for the past 2 months anyway, so why not make it official?
You mentioned in your campaign the crippling inactivity and mismanagement the office has seen. Who specifically do you have in mind for deputy speaker? Will the restructuring of the office and proper training of deputies provide the infrastructure needed to improve the office long term, even after you move on to another role?
That is the goal. If I come out of 1 term or 2 terms or however long as speaker, with that being in place, that would be the best possible legacy I could give. For deputy speaker, I want to keep Rom in the office. Rom's been really good when he came in. It just goes to show like how having someone who is active and dedicated and who is just available to do the work really matters and really can help change an office. I might keep Owen if I win. Owen hasn't been around as much, but he has been available when asked to do things, and I know he's got experience in the role previously, I believe. So he'd be good to have. And if Bob doesn't get tapped for a ministry, and I'm pretty sure he will be, depending on who wins the delegacy, I'd like him in the office as well. But there's always room for like people who are newer and people who who aren't as new, but who just want to get an idea for the office and the role and stuff like that. To just come in and help out, even if you're not staying for long. If someone wants to come and do a month in the deputy speaker's office, I'm not going to say no.
Do you plan on straight up appointing those deputy speakers or offering an application process wherein newcomers could potentially express their interest for the role?
I think we could expand the process that I think Dropia put in place for, and I see it's online for the first time in about 2 weeks. Never mind. Where we could expand the speaker staff application to include like an indication that you might want to be a deputy speaker. My plan for the speaker staff you know, is to turn it from something that's pursuing. It would be unkind to call them vanity projects, but they're not projects that are vital to the operation of the regional assembly or the speaker's office, like at all. Like the Know Your Laws project is a thing that has been mentioned a few times by various speakers, but has been dead in the water for the entire time that I've been in the office, bar like a 5-day period of activity, and nothing else has happened with it. So I'd rather use the speaker staff as a training program to train future deputy speakers. I feel like there needs to be a pipeline from speaker staff to deputy speaker to future speaker if people want it.
I think that's a great idea. To what extent are you going to personally help in training those deputy speakers?
Well, I'm around most of the time anyway. Like I think find, you know, if I'm not online, I'm a ping away, and I'll reply to that ping within an acceptable amount of time. So if I undertook the initial training of ROM, and I'd likely do a similar thing to what I did with him, which was to, uh, you know, wait until there's some checks to do, take him through the process of doing the check, checking that the nation they've given is accurate, checking that the oath is accurate, and that, and then through the process of updating the sheet and announcing that they've passed the check and things like that, and just making sure that the sheet was properly updated, because there's probably been people in the speaker's office that didn't even know how to update the sheet. That's the kind of mismanagement I feel like has gone on over multiple terms and multiple speakers.
That's definitely concerning. Another thing that you mentioned in your campaign is a sort of restructuring of the speakership in a parliamentary manner that helps to either resist or provide better scrutiny to appointments or bills that the delegate tries to push through the regional assembly. What do you consider the proper amount of time for scrutiny of government bills and appointments?
I think it depends on the change and what they're doing. Like an appointment doesn't need as much time as say a bill that gets rid of the attorney general. Although obviously the attorney general bill wasn't pushed by the delegate, but certain changes that we've had in the past have been the exemptions bill for military stuff. Um, Appointments, I think there needs to be a clear point where the questions are over and the candidate has answered them all acceptably. So if say there's 7 or 8 post questions and the candidate then answers them all, and then a day later or 2 days later someone moves for a vote, I'd be okay with letting that go to vote. But if the candidate answers those questions and then an hour later someone comes along and moves for a vote, that's not something that, as Speaker, I'd be comfortable with allowing.
Can you discuss your interest in censure? How would it be implemented, and what repercussions is it intended to have against elected officials?
Well, at its base form, a censure is the legislature issuing it saying this action or actions that you are undertaking are not something that we find acceptable. It's intended to force the official or the government or whoever to look at their actions again in light of that stated disapproval and make changes. It's not as extreme as a recall, but it's a first step, I think. Like, um, like a
So you're
recall.
thinking of it more as a warning rather than as a
Yeah.
full recall.
Yes. Yeah. Like there are some things that officials could be doing that the RA or the citizenship as a whole dislike. They don't think is acceptable for an official to do. But in all other aspects, the official is performing their role to the standards that the region expects. In that instance, I wouldn't push for a recall. I'd suggest a censure.
How frequently do you think the censure will be ascribed to a delegate, will be voted through the regional assembly if that ends up being implemented during your term?
I think it will be appropriately rare. I think maybe um, if it's pushed as an option, it will be attempted, perhaps more often than we as a region would like, but it's more about finding the right number of uses and the appropriateness for the situation. And that can only happen through experimentation, through trial and error. Like, sometimes we'll push a censure for, say, an MPA operation. Like, before like say an MPA operation goes through and, you know, the region has a reaction to it that's maybe not expected. But rather than pursuing, an override of that operation, say it ends before that can happen, a censure might be an option there. Or, maybe in the Rose Pierre stuff that happened earlier this term, that could have been dealt with a censure rather than a discussion over a recall.
Right, that's fair. So I've tried to give my best summary of the core points of your campaign, but I don't also want to put words into your mouth. Do you have anything else that you want to add to what those core points are, or subtract from things that I've suggested or implied?
I don't think you've misassigned meaning or intent to any part of my campaign that I haven't already said. It's not an ambitious campaign. I'll be the first to admit that. But at a certain point, I think an office needs realism rather than optimism or ambition. That's not to say I'm not ambitious. There are goals that I've set out for the speakership, and there are goals that I'm keeping to myself that we could maybe pursue should things go better than I expect them to. But I'm not going to be a person who sits here in their election campaign and says, "Yes, we are going to do X, Y, and Z." I'm not going to shoot for the moon in an election campaign when I know that it's unlikely that those goals could be delivered. I don't like that kind of campaign. I've said that many times. It's just not something that appeals to me.
So I've already mentioned censure as one thing that you might add to the rules of the regional assembly. Is there any rule that you would try to remove from those rules or standing procedures, and why?
Um, I'm not sure that there's an issue with the standing procedures per se, but I think there's a disconnect between what the standing procedures say and what people understand about the region and how the regional assembly works. And if I can help people to understand both the standing procedures and the regional assembly rules, maybe after that we can have a conversation of what can we improve and what do we not need anymore.
All right, thanks for that answer. At this point in the interview, I'm going to switch over to asking primarily audience related or publicly submitted questions. So the order might break up a little bit. But the first question that we've gotten submitted is from Iluvatar. How many more new citizens in the next week would it take before quorum couldn't be met with at least one of them voting?
That would be however many it says on the sheet is needed for quorum that then they don't vote for. I I don't have an answer for that question, but it's not something that the Speaker's office needs to concern itself with when the sheet tells us what quorum is.
His next question is, who is the Speaker pro tem?
The Speaker pro, I assume he's referring to a Speaker pro tempore, which is, I assume, some Latin term or pseudo Latin term for a constitutionally recognised officer of a legislature who presides over the chamber in the absence of the normal presiding officer. So, who is the Speaker pro tem? It would be a deputy speaker or anyone who is appointed to acting speaker.
How would you compare your current campaign for the office to the speakership with previous candidates to that office? In particular, will you be a better speaker than a mean old man, for instance?
I'm not aware of a period where Amino Man was Speaker of the RA. He might have been, and I might be forgetting. But in terms of like previous platforms, I
I'm
don't think
also unsure, by
anybody.
the way.
Yeah, I don't think anybody has put forth a campaign that is just based on getting back to basics, making sure the work is done, and building the office for the future. I think a lot of candidates, both for Speaker and for other roles like Attorney General in the past and any other elected roles, have a habit of promising things that sound good in their head, but without a practical plan of achieving it. There are a few people in the region who have become famous for that. Seem to remember a number of campaign platforms by Tomb who then failed repeatedly to deliver them. I My campaign differs from those campaigns in that it's realistic and achievable.
And I think that's one of the big things that we have to credit your campaign with being, because being something that's achievable is something that ultimately means that the regional assembly is going to hear their voice represented through you. So I just want to go back a little bit to the history again because Iluvatar has another question. That being, despite the mismanagement that we have seen in recent terms, who do you believe to have been the best speaker from TNP's history? And he suggests Gulliver and Crushing Our Enemies as examples.
I think those are both up there, but I honestly, I think Darkania might have been the best speaker I can remember. To be honest, I think he was an underrated speaker.
Is that despite his sort of leaving in the middle of some of his terms?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, I think um, you can be a good speaker for as long as you're, or any kind of official for as long as you're in the office, even if you do leave the office halfway through your term or before your term is up. If you leave the office in a better place than which you found it, you were a good speaker.
Iluvatar also asks, can you clarify the difference between abstain and present in regional assembly votes?
It's an irrelevant difference because we don't have present as part of our thing. Um, uh, they are functionally the same. I'm not sure I'd accept a ballot that said present rather than abstain, but that's something to discuss should it happen.
It wouldn't make any difference in any event anyway. Um, so Heighton here asks somewhat of a joke question. He asks, "What do you have to say about your opponents?" But I guess that's sort of going at the elephant in the room here, which is that you're currently running unopposed for the speakership. I'm going to change his question a little bit and ask instead, who else do you think is qualified to run as speaker at the time being?
I think anybody who is dedicated, has a passable knowledge of the laws and procedures of TMP, and who is willing to put the work in is qualified, and that makes a massive, a massive amount of people. I look in this call and I see 9003, I see Bormia, I see, you know, Heighton, who I nominated, Pridania, who I would have nominated if he wasn't standing for delegate. There's plenty of people in the region who could do speaker, but I don't think enough people know about the job of speaker who are willing to run, like not without having the experience of being a deputy speaker, which is why I want to turn the speaker staff into essentially production, like we do with the executive staff. You join a ministry, you become a deputy minister, you perform well, and a delegate notices and appoints you a minister. There's no reason that couldn't happen with the Speaker's office on a smaller scale. There are 9 members of the Speaker staff, possibly 10. One of them is ABC, who's a previous Speaker, and the rest I could see being Speakers at some point.
So I actually didn't know this because it's only half an hour ago that he accepted
Yeah,
his nomination, but it looks like Hayden accepted your nomination for him to be Speaker. Do you have anything that you'd like to say in encouragement to his campaign?
even if you don't win, if you run a good campaign and if you have good ideas, that is a start. You're running because there's only one candidate. That's fine, but that doesn't mean you don't have. That doesn't mean you have to run a joke campaign. You don't have to run a campaign like Mal's running, or a campaign like Lady Dominator's running for vice delegate. What I'd love to see is a platform from you that brings, maybe new ideas to the speaker's office, or like what your idea of what a speaker should do. There's room in this race certainly for an ambitious platform, because my platform's not ambitious. My platform is categorically not ambitious, and maybe there's room in the race for that. And maybe if you run an ambitious platform, people will vote for you. But if you run an ambitious platform, you then have to deliver. And the delivery is the hard part unless you have a good team around you and you are a talented, dedicated person.
I would definitely agree that delivery is the hard part, but also um, that having ideas and being a serious candidate in a race is something that, even if you're not going to win, is definitely going to have an influence on other campaigns, because even if you don't win, those ideas can go on to inspire others in their campaigns or inspire the current elected speaker in pursuing those ideas and improving the region. I don't see there as any excuse that you shouldn't propose cool ideas that improve the region. So, to move on to the next question, I know that you mentioned earlier, Madjack, about knowing your laws and whatnot, but Vivanco has a specific question about the current project in the Speaker's office, such as the Know Your Laws project. Do you have any opinion on that?
My opinion is, at the present moment in time, there is not enough activity to justify pursuing those projects when the speaker staff could be doing something that I would consider more useful both to the office and to the regional assembly as a whole. Stuff like the Know Your Laws project and the training manual and stuff like that may have a positive effect one day. But at the moment, with the state that the office is in, with how it's been run for not just this term, and the way that my campaign has played out is that it seems like I'm criticising Doropia, and there are things to criticise Doropia for, absolutely, but there's major asterisks against that, in that Doropia had to go away because he lost internet, because of coronavirus and the measures undertaken in his country. So there will always be an asterisk over his term. At the same time, before Doropia, we had Yukira, who should never be given a role of authority in this region ever again. I like him as a person, but he just shouldn't. He's bad. He's honestly terrible. Before that, there was a speaker. I forget who. I don't want to name them because I might get them mixed up with another person. Um, who left halfway through because they were appointed to a ministry, which is something I also don't want to happen. If I appoint deputy speakers, I will ask them to say no to any ministerial appointments they get. They don't have to, but that's just common courtesy in my opinion. I've lost my train of thought entirely.
Well, I'll move on then, I guess. I also don't want to be too hostile
I'm
in this
sorry.
particular. Don't worry about it. The next question we have is from a Luvatar who asks, legal positivism, natural law, or something else?
What is easily explainable to the region in 5 minutes?
Well, give yourself 10 because it doesn't look like we have any other publicly submitted questions.
I just, like, I know we're a political simulator, and I know we're a legislature, But ideological approaches to law are not something I am interested in. I would much rather focus on the, you know, effective, competent running of the office. I don't have an opinion on legal positivism versus natural law beyond my basic understanding of natural law and what I understand from a law class taken 10 years ago is I'm not entirely happy with that entire thing. But that's a personal thing rather than an approach to law. Like highfalutin questions over that, over you know approaches to a legislature, over a parliamentary, over a presidential system. They don't matter. Ultimately, what matters is that the speaker's work is done. What matters is that things are done on time or in a timely fashion. What matters is, people who are citizens and are masked as such and are on the right sheet. And I did an audit of the residents group earlier in the term. There was one resident on there whose nation had existed 2 years and 156 days ago.
Which just goes to show how incompetent or inactive previous speakers have been.
Yeah, and also just people just not removing people when they should be. Like maybe they missed it. Maybe they removed it from the sheet but forgot to move it from the group. Or maybe an admin missed a post in the admin request thread. Because it wasn't always the speaker's office that did these things. So there's like any number of reasons could be there for why this person was still in the group. But what ultimately matters is they were in the group and hadn't been removed. And residence is not really an issue, but say if they were citizens, that's a big deal.
So I know you've promised to definitely pick up the activity within the speaker's office, specifically regarding citizen applications. Boromir is asking, how often will you check the citizen list and citizen apps thread, and how quickly will you be able to get involved your deputy speakers in that process?
At the moment, I'm currently checking it every day. I might not post every day, but I'm checking it every day. The goal has to be with the team that you have around you, no matter how big it is, that you are getting to speakers checks, say every 2 days at a maximum. I think that's a reasonable goal. I think that's achievable. I think if you have yourself and 3 deputy speakers who are competent and who are dedicated and who like to apply themselves, you can do that with ease. And if you ever get to a point where you're doing a check but then you have to go away, you should be able to ping another deputy speaker or me in the speaker's server and say, "Hi, I'm just doing speakers checks, but I've got to go. Can you fill out the sheet for me?" That should then be done. You should be able, you should have a team around you that is able to reply and do that, on the same day or within 12 hours or whatever reasonable time limit you want to put on it.
So, what are your thoughts on speakers participating in the debate and casting votes that could potentially pass or fail a piece of legislation in the regional assembly?
I think a speaker has to be very careful because the speaker's chair ultimately is an independent, largely neutral position. And I say largely neutral because the speaker's role is also primarily to protect the members of the legislature from an overbearing executive. I'm not saying we have an overbearing executive, but we have a system where there is a potential for that. So part of my role would be to protect the members of the regional assembly from potentially an overbearing executive. In terms of votes, I have since joining the office, I think I've abstained on almost every vote. I know I abstained on Wondrous's commission appointment, and I abstained on the recent vote on the exemptions. I may have voted aye actually on the other exemptions, so I might not actually be correct there. But I think as Speaker, my ongoing policy would be to abstain from all votes, except in certain circumstances that I don't know, maybe a declaration of war, or maybe something suitably serious that I would feel very strongly about.
I guess my next question to follow up on that then is essentially based on the fact that you have censure as part of your campaign, will you yourself propose changes to the laws that govern the regional assembly? And if so, how will you ensure that you will remain impartial? Will that just be by abstaining on those votes, or will you still actively argue in favor of those changes?
I think if I was proposing a change to the law, and there are some laws that I still think need changing or updating, like our Freedom of Information Act, that needs to be, updated and made appropriate for the Discord era that we find ourselves in. Um, I think were I to propose a law, I would not serve as, the person presiding over that debate and the process that law took. I would instruct one of my deputy speakers to preside over that process. Um, I would. I think I'd probably abstain again, despite arguing in favour of it. But I can't. I don't know if I can commit to that because that could change on a whim at the time, which might sound bad, but it's just the nature of me.
I mean, all right, I guess that's fair enough given that you've now said that publicly. You also just mentioned the Freedom of Information Act in the Discord era. Could you clarify your thoughts on what changes you think need to be made to that?
I'm not sure if I have like specific change, like specific wording I would want inserted into the act. What I can say is that I recognise the difficulty that delegates have in abiding by declassification, because under the law, government records over a year old need to be declassified. I'm aware that cabinet channels fall under this, and that they can contain, hundreds, like thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lines that a delegate would have to go through, to omit any sensitive information, to omit any personal information of people, and then declassify. I'm aware that's a big job, but if we're not going to abide by the laws, why do we have them? Is my reply to that. And I feel like we need to potentially strengthen that and also apply it to the other areas of government. Macedonia brings up a good point when he says, you know, only the executive government is required to declassify records. I feel like we could apply that to also the judiciary, potentially the Security Council, although obviously that would require, additional measures to protect regional security. Um, it's a conversation that the region needs to have rather than just one or two people. And I think I would, try and seek as many opinions as possible. Even if I were ultimately to write something, I would seek first as many opinions and as many approaches as possible. Because, someone like Praetor may have a different approach to Macedonia, you may have a different approach to Pridania, etc., etc.
Thank you for providing a thorough answer to that. I'm going to move on and ask if a vote is canceled due to the objections of the citizenry in the regional assembly, and then subsequently, after that cancellation, another vote is motioned for, how would you respond to that hypothetical circumstance?
I would. I'd have to take another look at the regional assembly rules and standing procedures to um, see whether this approach would be entirely kosher. But my opinion in that, like my actions in that situation, would be to look at the bill and to see, to ask myself, has this changed in a significant enough fashion that I could say it is a different bill to the one that was motioned to vote and that was objected to? And if it wasn't, I'm not sure I could schedule the vote because materially, the bill has to change, in my opinion. If the citizenry has objected to the vote, they are saying we don't want this vote to happen, and they've objected in enough numbers to stop it. So it would be going against that stated will of the Assembly or a portion of the Assembly to move the same bill to vote without any changes. I think I would require the bill to have been changed in a significant manner.
Back to your earlier discussion of appointing deputies in order to train them and help promote active citizenship application processes and whatnot. How many deputies do you plan on appointing for the office?
Anywhere between 3 and 9.
That's quite a number. What are the specific traits that you're looking for in a deputy speaker?
Availability, willingness to learn, and dedication. It can be a boring role, especially if you have a lot of it's data entry, it's paperwork. A lot of the role is just that. At the same time, I think there's enough region there's enough people in the region that could do well at the role that, if required, I would cast the net as far wide as possible. Like, if I think would do a good job and they're willing to serve, even if it's for a few weeks or a month, I would appoint regardless of who else is in the office. At the same time, if someone in the office isn't active and they can't give me a good reason to be active, I would remove them from the office and appoint someone else. I don't see you're a minister. How many people are in your ministry?
I mean, I'm actually not a minister.
I
But when I
apologize.
was
I thought you were a
formerly
minister.
a minister, as Minister of Communications, I probably had about 10 people in my ministry. I think I at one point had something like 4 or 5 active deputies, and I was able to justify that by the quantity of work that needed to be done.
At a point in time where you have a YouTuber making videos on nation states, and we are getting 30 to 40 applications a day, which happened the other day. I think we had something like 35 applications in one day. I would argue that there is functionally no difference between the executive staff of a ministry and the deputy speaker staff, except in one sense. I would have to appoint deputy speakers to do the work. I can't have the speaker staff do it. So I would essentially have to appoint 6 or 7 deputy speakers to do the work of what would be done by, say, executive staff who aren't necessarily deputy ministers. Maybe that's something we should address in the laws. Maybe it's not. But at the same time, I don't see why there needs to be, you know, say I appoint 6 deputy speakers. I don't see why there would need to be an eyebrow raised.
So you've mentioned the large number of citizenship applications that we've seen recently. Do you really expect that high number to continue, even though YouTubers aren't necessarily going to make videos throughout the next, term? And if so, would at some point you have to lay off certain deputies in order to make sure that the workload is evenly managed between them?
I think we're going to see residual effect from the 2 videos that are already made over the next, over the next month or so, at least. If he makes another video, or another YouTuber of similar size makes another video, that's potentially another influx. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the potential is there. At the same time, if it doesn't happen and the number of applications dies off to where it was before the videos were made, would I lay off deputy speakers? I think what I would do in that situation is possibly revive some of the projects that I think could be done, could be achievable. Like, say, the speaker's training manual is a project that's been, I think, may have had its genesis in Artemis's term as speaker, and hasn't really gone that far. So I think maybe I would set some of them to do that. Maybe they don't have to stay deputy speakers to do that. Maybe I would, encourage them to also seek work in the executive ministries. And I know I said earlier that I would ask my deputy speakers not to take ministerial appointments, but maybe I would relax that in that situation. Uh, there's a potentially wide range of scenarios there, and I'm not saying I will be appointing, say, 6 deputies, but I'm not saying I'm not. And in that situation, there's a wide range of approaches to find the best balance of work possible.
So I hate to go into more detail about it because you've already given us a lot on deputy speakers and whatnot. But given that it's such a core part of your campaign, I also wanted to ask if, how much of the workload are you going to share with them? Is it only going to be citizenship applications, or are there other ways that the speakership can expand its role in order to accommodate deputy speakers and giving them work that will help train them for eventually becoming speaker?
I think one of my first actions as a deputy speaker was to tally and count the votes in the first exemptions vote. And there's no better way of learning like our procedures and how to do things than having to count the votes for 27 exempted regions, all of which have differing numbers, all of which have differing outcomes. Despite ultimately all passing, they all had differing numbers in the icon. Um, in in that instance, there is a lot to be said for learning on the job. I would. Um, there's a few ways to approach, learning the non-paper or like the non-administrative parts of the speaker's job. And you can either have people shadowing you as you tally up legislative votes and stuff like that, or you can say, this vote has ended. I need you to count the votes and post the closing post and announce the results. And then going back afterwards and saying, what did you have issues with? What did you find easy? How can I help you do a better job in the future? I'm not sure what my approach would be. I'm not sure what's the best approach. And it may well be a thing that will say I appoint Bob and Rom as deputy speakers. What works for Rom might not work for Bob, and vice versa. And it's about finding that correct approach for the deputy speaker in question.
All right. I guess the last question that we have that is audience submitted here is from Bormiar. She's asking, who do you think we should declare war on, if any?
The time has passed for us to declare war on any particular region. I think we should have declared war on the Confederation of Corrupt Dictators. Maybe they're changing now with recent announcements, but I'm not sure they are. But that's something more in the executive mind to talk about. And yeah. Also, go read Heighten's thread when it's up. It'll be a laugh. It'll be about as funny as the double doink was.
I guess the final question I have before we wrap this up is why did you make your campaign thread titled "This is not a campaign thread"? You're clearly not a joke candidate, and I'm just wondering why you injected that humor into your campaign.
Um, because honestly, my campaign's a little dry, isn't it? Like it's not an ambitious, optimistic campaign of the office for the office. It's very realistic. It's very grounded. But reading it without that added dose of humor, I wouldn't be a candidate that inspired me. So being a little light with it, being humorous with that, being humorous with it's just something I've always injected into my writing because sometimes I can take things too seriously, and that is a way to remind me and also to remind the reader that ultimately we're playing a text-based nation simulator by a middling Australian author to advertise his book. And things aren't as serious as they might seem sometimes.
All right. Cormier, I guess, has a final question here. Are war declarations really a thing anymore, anyways?
I mean, with the exemptions, there's a lot of leeway for the executive government to do things, and war is a serious matter. It's a policy thing. I can't say if I was delegate, I would have taken the actions that Macedonia did, but I wasn't delegate, so it's easy to sit here and say Macedonia should have done this, this, and this, and not this, this, and this. I have that I have that ability to do that because we all have that ability to do that. But it's not really, it's not. It's I'm thinking too much into a question that wasn't really serious. That's what I'm doing here.
Yes, you are.
Are war declarations really a thing anymore? Anyways, they're provided for in the law, so yes.
All right. Well, at this point, given that we're not really looking at any more serious questions, and given that I don't have any more in my war chest, I guess, of available questions, thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this town hall, for contributing questions, both serious and not serious. And thank you, Madjack, for taking the time, especially on such short notice, to participate in this town hall.
It's always a pleasure to come on the MBS, and it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much.